please help get the truth out of the bag to free Tom Brady. This video shows that the key work in the whole scandal would actually vindicate the Patriots once you re-examine it after correcting for hidden assumptions that Exponent knew were wrong. Basically, accounting for the fact that they took the balls out of the bag and let them warm up, whereas on game day the balls were left in a bag before they were tested. That one thing changes the whole course of the scandal. A little background for folks here. The NFL used a company called Exponent to run experiments and compare them to game day data to allegedly prove that it is more likely than not that the Patriots cheated. So Exponent's data actually clears Tom Brady once you realize that their simulation basically took the balls out to warm them, but on game day the balls remained in the bag on the floor. Could this make a difference? The Exponent testing was indistinguishable in their simulation from the other testing Exponent did, where the ball was on this pedestal, on this table, with this instrument hooked up to it. Anybody who's gone grocery shopping and come home with their groceries probably knows that stuff warms up more slowly if you keep it in a bag than if you take it out and set it in the open. And yet Exponent claims that they can't imagine there being any significant difference between these situations. Their conclusion utterly depends on them being unable to imagine that there's much of a difference. What do you think? So how do I know that their conclusion wholly depends on this issue? Well, look at the concluding paragraph in their report. It calls out that their whole conclusion is contingent, in particular, regarding assumptions about the timing and sequencing of the measurements. So here's how that works on the one graph that's most crucial to their entire conclusion. So they say that the balls were in the locker room an average of 4 minutes before they were measured for the Patriots. So you read the graph at the 4-minute mark, and the trend indicated by the red dots is right where you see that dot happens to be right on the money there. So that particular dot says most likely case is that the ball pressure that was measured, a little over 11.2 psi, differed from the simulation, because the simulation was on the upper limit of the uncertainty band. So it doesn't really prove cheating, but it says more likely than not that there was cheating, if of course you believe the ref about how much time transpired. If the testing was done sooner, no harm, no foul. But no particularly strong reason was given to distrust the NFL about the timing of their tests. The American Enterprise Institute did a thing where they called into question the timing, but the NFL said, well, gosh, we have all this eyewitness testimony that it really took about 4 minutes, so they ignored that evidence. But there's a different way to understand what's going on here. What if the being in the bag slowed the warming by only 25%? Then Deflategate is over, and Tom Brady should be set free. If the balls warmed up only 75% as much during the testing, in reality, compared to the testing, then in other words, during the 4 minutes the balls were in the locker room in the real game day situation, they only warmed up as much as they would have in 3 minutes of the Exponent test, where the balls are basically out on a table. So the effect of accounting for the temperature rising more slowly when they're in the bag is the same thing as just changing the time scale. So when you read Exponent's own data at the 3-minute mark, now you get to the conclusion that the simulated pressure becomes well within that band of uncertainty, indicating that there's nothing unusual about how well their simulation matches the game day data, and no reason to believe that there was any tampering, just random variation why it didn't happen to exactly match the game day data. So to preview the actions I'm looking for to help spread the word, get attention to this, get the court's attention to this. Eventually that'll get Goodell out and the Patriots draft picks back once people realize that there's no evidence that the Patriots cheated. But let's look a little deeper to make sure you can understand how I know these to be true and how you can know them to be true by looking at the data rather than taking my word for it. So how do we know that Exponent basically took the balls out of the bag during their simulation? Well, we know this from the Exponent report. check out figure 20. That's where the picture came from. That was the test apparatus setup for the transient curves. That led to figure 21, which defined these curves, and then figure 22 was a blow-up of those curves for the locker room portion, and then they carried the blow-up of those curves into figure 29 and 30, which were the two key ones they wanted you to look at. 30 is the one you look at even if you believe the ref about what gauge you used. 29 is the one you look at if you don't believe the ref. Notice that in all those experiments, the trend of the dots is nicely running parallel to the transient curves. So that's the most obvious evidence that during the simulation the pressure and temperature was rising almost exactly as fast as would happen when the balls were on that test apparatus placed by themselves on a pedestal on a table rather than in a bag. Now, just to make sure there's no uncertainty on this, I want to call attention to the fact that on the left it almost does look like the balls might be warming up a little more slowly. For the Patriots balls, those are the red dots in the simulated data. But the simulated data on the right side shows that if anything, the balls are warming up faster than they would if they were on a pedestal on a table, which of course is nonsense. They wouldn't, no reason to believe they'd warm up faster. And curiously enough, those points are different measurements of the exact same balls at within seconds of each other using two different gauges. So the only reason why those points differ a bit is there's a little uncertainty in the measurement process. So whether the balls are rising a little slower or a little faster than the transient curves, it all averages out. And of course the Colts balls there show that they both paralleled the curve exactly. And so you can see that the balls during the simulation of the game day that Exponent did were rising just as fast as they did if they were out on a table, and therefore not as anybody would reasonably expect them to rise if they were in a bag, because the bag would cause them to rise more slowly. Remember, that's in the bag with a bunch of other footballs, and the bag itself may be damp, and the bag was probably closed before they got ready and opened up the bag, started taking the balls out and testing them. So the simulation doesn't match what really happened in game day. Now, how do we know that the data screams that? But wouldn't you think that they looked for this? Well, their weasel wording indicates that they specifically excluded this. Notice how they first say that the procedure was used to generate the halftime measurements to make it just like game day. So that sounds like they covered everything that they are aware of that could make a difference, and they were certainly aware that the bags could make a difference. But then they follow that with the word namely in this other phrase. Look up the Google definition of namely, and namely means the same thing as that is to say. So they say the procedure was replicated, that is to say we used the logo and non-logo gauges. So what they're really doing is disavowing any attempt to simulate how the balls were handled. They're specifically excluding that anything other than the use of the two different gauges matched when comparing their simulation to the real-world events. So the fact that they weasel-worded this and that their data clearly indicates the balls are out of the bag is strong evidence. On top of that, there is the AEI report having noticed that the balls measured during the actual halftime were, if anything, sinking in pressure, which is illogical, but certainly unlikely that they were rising in pressure as fast as Exponent claimed they were. In fact, if you plug the data into Microsoft Excel and do a regression analysis and use
because standing up for friends and family is priceless.
6 out of 7 is your confidence interval. Excel will tell you that there is slightly less than a 1 in 7 chance that Exponent simulation could have been right, given the data that was observed that the balls weren't rising in pressure. So they know this was an issue. They know their experiment likely didn't match. They've weasel-worded their results to try to work around the problem, and their data was screaming at them that they hadn't simulated the effect of the balls warming up more slowly because they're in the bag. So far, we've seen that they hid important differences between their test and reality, and that those differences would clear the Patriots, but their conclusion, they pretended not to know those differences. Their conclusion implicating the Patriots was wrong, and they knew it. And you can see this for yourself. You can see that if the ref was right, the Exponent data clears the Patriots of any measurable cheating. Now what about the issue of the gauges? Exponent gave 3 reasons for not believing the ref about which gauge he used, and they're all bogus. A little background here. The ref and the Patriots and the Colts must have all used similar gauges because the pregame measurements all aligned with what they were supposed to at the pregame period. So you see in italics the reasons that Exponent gave for not believing the ref, and we'll take them one by one to see that none of them make any sense, and Exponent knows it. First one is that most of the gauges tested were like the one the ref didn't use. Well, the reason that most of the gauges tested were like the one the ref didn't use is Exponent went out of their way to buy only gauges that were the exact same model number that the ref said he didn't use. So all that proves is that Exponent chose to buy gauges like the one the ref said he didn't use. It does nothing to prove that there's anything at all unusual about the gauge the ref said he did use. In fact, to the contrary, their testing showed that if you buy gauges of all the same model, they'll have about the same bias built into them, either overread or underread by about the same amount from gauge to gauge to gauge. So this actually proves that it's likely that any of the gauges of the model the ref said he used read the same way as the one the ref said he used. So that's further evidence that there's actually nothing at all unusual about the gauge the ref used. So no reason to think that the Patriots and Colts couldn't have used the same model of gauge that the ref said he used. Now let's look at the second thing. They say that people care about how closely calibrated it is. And yet we all know that nobody was concerned with calibrating their gauges. Nobody knew that 3% made any kind of difference. So that's a silly reason to give. And the third thing is even more silly. In 2 different places here, they claim that people would not want a gauge that overreads, that they would go particularly out of their way to avoid having a gauge that overreads. And yet, having a gauge overreads helps you make the football softer. Because if your gauge overreads, then you can get the pressure to look right without putting as much air in the football, so you can get a softer ball. They claim that everybody wants a softer ball, therefore, well, with the exception of Aaron Rodgers anyway, and therefore they claim that people would actually prefer a gauge like the one the ref said he used and not want a gauge like Exponent claims the ref used. Thus, Exponent knows that all of the reasons they gave for distrusting the ref make no sense whatsoever. So what to do? Please help spread the word. Somehow we've got to get this to the attention of the press and the Patriots so that people become aware of it. If we don't do this quickly, then Tom might strike some kind of a deal to make sure that he at least plays some of the first 4 games, and that would be a shame. If somebody could help me find some volunteer legal help from a lawyer who's admitted to practice at the court that's hearing this case, that would help because I prepared a draft friend of the court brief, known as an amicus brief, to spell this out and other things in much more detail to make sure that the ref considers it when he's thinking about the case. And of course the other thing to do is to cause a public outcry that will get Goodell out so that the replacement commissioner will correct these wrongs and give the Patriots their draft picks back. So please do share this. Find more at www.betterdialogue.com/deflategate. Please excuse that being a super primitive website that I managed to stand up so I could share these results. So let's help free Tom Brady. Thanks for listening.